Welcome, everybody. We're joined today again by Bryan Sentes, who is a Montreal-based English professor and poet. And so Jeffrey Kripal's take on UFOs, I think you mentioned on your blog that Vallee has kind of taken to it, but I'm not entirely clear about how it differs from Vallee's previous take, because you talk about Kripal's hermeneutic approach, and hermeneutics has got to do with interpretation, but I already thought that Vallee was kind of looking, as you say, about in terms of like the significance of the UFO narrative, like it's beyond just the literal meaning of the story. So I'm not sure like how
Kripal this is very complex matter. Okay. Vallee himself confesses he learns about hermeneutics from Jeffrey Kripal. Vallee, of course, even before their meeting and learning about the term hermeneutics itself, was, as you say, pardon me, developing this view that the way that the UFO presents itself is not the truth of the UFO. That in a way, the example I use is that it's like a sentence in a language learner's book. This is an idea I get from Roland Barthes. So you read something, you're learning a language and you see a sentence in a book, and what's important is not the meaning of the sentence, rather it's the sentence as an example of something, right? And so for Vallee, very early on, certainly with Magonia and afterward there was the Invisible College, and then there's the Messengers of Deception. There we go. Certainly in that book, he's putting forward the idea that the UFOs appear, the landings, the contacts, the seeing the occupants. It's all a kind of drama in a way. It poses a kind of a koan, is the word that he uses, which suggests, and I'm surprised he hasn't picked up on this, a semiotic or a semiological approach to the phenomena. So I can imagine that when he spoke with Jeffrey Kripal, and Kripal introduced this idea of hermeneutics to Vallee, Vallee was quite happy now to have a very well-developed discourse to develop this idea. I don't know how deeply he's gotten into that. If you read the Trinity that he wrote with Paula Harris, he pushes this point again. And it's kind of refreshing in a way, although, of course, as is well known now, the story he was working with was a fabrication. This has been very well established. But he makes a great deal out of the fact that it landed around the time of the atomic bomb, and there were so many things that happened in threes and this and that, and he begins to read it in a very quote-unquote symbolic form, which is interesting if any of it were true. So you've got that side that he's developing. Kripal's idea of hermeneutics is troubling. Like he's written a lot, and I really want to sort of get much deeper and get a much more fine-grained version of what he's on about. Because on the one hand, hermeneutics traditionally just means the art of interpretation, right? As long as there have been literary texts, we've had to interpret them. Famously, even at the time of Plato, they didn't know what the Homeric poems meant. And actually, I found out within like 2 centuries of the Homeric poems appearing, they were already being interpreted allegorically. So in terms of quote-unquote literature, then with the in Judaism, you've got the Mishnah, which is the commentary around the Talmud. This is a kind of hermeneutics as well. So you get with scripture, you've got hermeneutics. With poetry, you've got hermeneutics. With law, you've got hermeneutics, because the laws have got to be interpreted and understood and applied and so on. And then this is where Kripal is coming from, I think, being a religious studies scholar. Mm-hmm. There is an expansion of hermeneutics in the 18th century with Friedrich Schleiermacher, which I'm pretty sure Kripal would be aware of, to talk about understanding in general. And then in the 20th century, this becomes much more radicalized in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, following on Husserl, where even perception is interpretive in a sense, that things are given to us as things quite spontaneously, right? I see something as a tree, I see something as a microphone. I see something as a glass of water. I don't see it as, it is a glass of water, it is a camera, it is a tree, but it presents itself in a certain aspect, in a certain signification, would be the word that Husserl and Heidegger used. So this idea of hermeneutics expands, and it's much more radicalized. And I don't know what, if anything, Kripal does with that. So I'd really have to dig much deeper into his latest book on UFOs. And I'm really drawing much of what I've said from the book that he wrote with Whitley Strieber, The Supernatural. And then from whatever podcasts I've caught him on every once in a while. This teaching for a living is very bitter because it keeps me from doing everything that I want to do. I've got piles of books behind me that I really want to get to. And it's actually keeping me from writing too, which is very, very frustrating. But that would be my initial response to the place of hermeneutics and Vallee and Kripal. Certainly for Vallee, he wants to read the UFO as a religious experience. What he wants to do with that it's always very difficult to say, because he's got this very irritating style. This came out in the 1990s. You find it in people like Jodie Dean, at least in an early book of hers. You find it in Richard Rorty a little bit, the American philosopher. You find it in this book I just read for this weekend's reading circle, James Madden. You find it in Jeffrey Kripal. And you find it in Diane Persalka's first book. It's this kind of easy breezy, loosey-goosey, conversational way of talking about like really complicated things. And I can understand that. I know what the drive for that is, but there must be a way to write to write about deeply complex matters in a way that doesn't fall into like the really stiff, soul-crushing style of the academic journal, right? And so I think of people such as Theodor Adorno, not so much Martin Heidegger. He's got his own style. But I mean, if you're going to write about these things, you have to identify your thoughts with your speech. There can't be a space between what you're saying and what you're thinking. And it doesn't mean you get like really rigid and rigorous, but you can be very exacting in what you write, right? And that's what I really miss, and that's why it's hard to sort of pin him down sometimes. You go, well, what exactly is he saying there? How does he exactly understand Kant? How does he understand Husserl exactly? And so on. And I've taken him to task on this, and I've taken Pasulka to task on this on the blog on a couple of times. Yeah, so it's difficult to sort of say exactly where they're coming from. My impression is, and I have yet to verify this, is that Kripal's drive is got at least two roots. First is his association with the Human Potentiality Movement with the Esalen Institute. And second was his undergoing his own sort of religious experience in India. And I think these two things orient a lot of his thinking in the direction of his career. But again, that is something I would have to dig into much more deeply to stand behind as a position.
As I understand it, like a narrative has got at least four kind of levels or layers. There's the syntactic, there's the semiotic, there's the semantic, and then there's the hermeneutic. Would you say that's correct?
Well, that depends on the different school. I mean, it's funny. It's, of course, Easter weekend, and that's when I sit down and read through Dante's Paradiso, the Commedia, the Divine Comedy. And in a letter to Cangrande, this is the 13th century, he talks about fourfold meaning there. So there he talks about, so speaking of the Bible, he talks about the literal meaning, the historical meaning, the allegorical meaning, and the symbolic meaning. I think I'd have to review that myself. So if we take the story of the Hebrews fleeing Egypt, there's a literal meaning, which we just take it as a story of the people being freed from Egypt and running away. The historical aspect, which is part of the history of the Hebrew people. The allegorical meaning, how does that work again? I'm not too sure. because there's a further meaning where as you might know, that in Christianity, is it anagogical, analogical? I'm not too sure. They see elements of the Old Testament looking ahead to the New Testament. So the Hebrews being 40 years in the wilderness is analogically related to Christ's 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness and things like this. So it depends. I mean, hermeneutics is a very, very old and complex field. So it'd be hard for me to say, well, yes. But I know that at least in the Middle Ages, there was a fourfold approach to interpretation. What the levels are, again, I'd have to review for myself. I'm much more conversant with the sort of universal hermeneutics of Schleiermacher and the way that's been put to use in someone like Hans-Georg Gadamer.
Who do you think was kind of the most prescient of the contactees? If we're thinking about the things going on today, maybe with the environment, maybe with geopolitics, is there a contactee from the 1950s, 60s era that kind of strikes you as having been basically on point?
Well, the one that springs to mind right off the bat is Rael, right? Now he of course has his contact in the 70s. I think it's 74 if I remember correctly. I mean, if we think of Adamski or Fry or Betherum or some of these others, they're not very forward looking. They're very concerned about the present moment. You think of the religions that come out of this, like the Aetherius Society and Unarius, not quite the same. But it's really Rael, who maybe it was when he came around that allows him to do this, because of course the Raelians they picked up on cloning back in 2000. They claimed to have cloned a human being, for example. In terms of AI and robotics, they're all for it, right? With their notion of paradism, and that goes back even into Rael's earliest work. That the ideal society is one that is run by the most intelligent. Oh ho, there's the tech bros, right? They think that because they're the richest, they're the smartest, right? And it would be, all the labor would be done by robots, biological or mechanical. So of these, certainly Rael is the most prescient of them all, because his whole approach to things is really coming to fruition now, and they're quite happy with that. GMOs, the Raelians are all in favor of GMOs, for example. Anything to do with science or technology and its applications. I'm not too sure what they say about Bitcoin and blockchain technology. I haven't seen anything they say about that. And what's interesting is they're kind of anti-vaxxers, which is quite dissonant. But during COVID, they were against vaccination. And I don't understand the logic behind that, to be honest. There's a bit of paranoia, like you find, a distrust perhaps of the pharmaceutical industry, maybe. I'm not sure.
Now, but so staying on the contactees, though, that movement never really went away, as you know, but like the current contactee movement or stories are sort of, they're not literally, they're not necessarily a continuation of the ones from the 60s or the 50s or 60s or even the 70s, in that they're not really kind of, or as I see it, they're not necessarily a movement as such. It's more like disparate stories. And that could have to do with the fragmentation of digital media, where you can sort of just share your stories individually. You don't have to be part of a group. Do you see it that way?
That certainly got part of it. I mean, the thing is, Adamski's really kind of the first, and then people imitate him, and then it just kind of flowers or grows out like from there, I would imagine. Speaking of contactees in the present, are you thinking of, there are a lot of people who are kind of channelers, a lot of channelers that are out there. Is that someone you class as a contactee?
Yeah, I'm thinking kind of people on Twitter or other social media who've got their own accounts of their experiences. They do share certain motifs of visual tropes, I guess, but they're basically their own thing, is the impression I get. But they do also enter into, chat spaces and, things of that sort. But it's kind of just, I don't know if calling it a movement is correct anymore.
No, I don't think so. Although it's a good question, isn't it? This is, I mean, I haven't looked at things from the sort of sociology of religion point of view explicitly for many, many years. The sort of people you're talking about, I'm familiar with, but I call them kind of experiencers. Yeah. There's a fellow who wrote a book called The UFO of God, for example. And these are people who claim close and ongoing contact with quote unquote non-human intelligences. And this kind of segues or dovetails into all the stories around Skinwalker Ranch and the hitchhiker effect and this sort of thing. Who was the person who worked with Travis Walker on the UAP task force? He just came out with a book, because I mean, some of these people who were in this whole sort of post 2017 scene claim to have orbs come their way, and then they've got weird experiences. And I haven't looked at that very closely because it's such a vast literature. I got so many other things that I'm doing that I want to follow up on. Something I want to look at eventually, but it's just so uninteresting in a way, because it's so much a repeat of what we've heard in a way. It's like in Hollywood, you've got all these remakes, and in television you've got these reboots, and it doesn't seem to add anything to the whole conversation. But then I'm speaking from a point of view of relative ignorance, so I may very well be mistaken about that. But you do find these people, a number of them, at the Sol Foundation conferences, at the Archives of the Impossible conferences, for example, and they have a kind of a place. And Pasulka talks about some of these in her latest book, Encounters, which I haven't had a chance to take a close look at yet. So maybe these are the sorts of people you're talking about. They're not. It's funny. It's very interesting, isn't it? Given the way the story has developed over time, if we compare the early sorts of stories, if we take George Adamski as our archetype, which is well taken. A flying saucer lands, pretty blonde guy gets out, speaks with him telepathically, and gives him some sort of message. With these people, I don't know. I'd really have to. I'd have to look at their stories more closely.
You did remind me, though,
it's not unfamiliar. You see, it's funny how it's very close to a certain strain in the abduction literature, like the Andreasen stories, where you get people who've been kind of abducted from being young children all through their lives, and then their children and then their grandchildren, and you get this long sort of story that goes back over many, many years, and they develop a kind of relationship with their abductors, right? And this seems to be very similar to that in a way. I guess if I get some time, I'll have to dig into at least a couple of these stories just to orient myself.
You did bring up I think you meant Travis Taylor. Travis
Taylor, yeah, the guy on the Skinwalker Ranch, the blonde physicist. He was half of the UAP task force,
right,
which tells us a lot about the UAP task force. Yeah. And he was working with someone. Well, I forget his name, though. I can see him in my mind's eye, but I can't remember his name. And he just published a book.
There's a whole bunch of them now.
Yep.
There's also like this latest crop of whistleblowers, so-called whistleblowers, including Jake Barber, Jason Sands, and others. And they seem to consistently invoke kind of esoteric ESP-themed stories. Yes. And that is a trend that I'm definitely noticing.
Yeah, you're thinking of this fellow who talked about the sort of egg-shaped object that was called down by the psionics who were in
exactly
part of the team. Yeah, I think that Chris Carter is probably unhappy that he hasn't had a chance to exploit these stories, because they come again, they're cut from the same cloth that we've been reading about and knowing about for a long time. it's funny the how much hay Jeremy Corbell and is it Ross? I can't remember. Is Coulthart? Is that his the fellow from Australia? How much mileage they've been able to make of all these stories. But again, it just seems so much of the same old. And this is why I'm really this whole post 2017 moment is so irritating for those of us who've been interested in the matter for time before. There's even, as you probably know, this expression 17er, which the older guard uses of these people who climbed on the bandwagon after 2017 and are all gaga and who read a lot of stuff really quickly. And it's funny because I know my experience when I returned, as a boy, I was interested in the matter, but then in 1994, I came back to it more seriously because of the intuition I had concerning abduction stories. And if you take a deep dive into literature, a lot of it seems very persuasive offhand. But the longer you hang around, the more you see, even the most sort of classic cases begin to fall apart and fray under examination and such. Even stories that are taken quite seriously by certain physicists at the Society for UAP Studies. And you start to see it all just dissolve in front of your eyes. And then it becomes interesting as a sociological phenomenon, as a cultural phenomenon, as a psychological phenomenon. And there is, I think, to my mind, a certain hardcore, very recalcitrant cases that are really quite intriguing. But I mean, that's not enough to hang your hat on, as people like Kripal do, and Madden, this guy who I was just reading, and others do. And they haven't been around long enough for that to happen to them. These 17ers, even very, very well-meaning, very learned, very intelligent people. It takes time to go through that process of familiarizing yourself with this vast gray literature, and working into finding all the different ways that different things are not as persuasive as they might seem. This doesn't mean to say that people don't see things, doesn't mean to say that people don't experience things, but the status of those experiences is very curious, but it's not as cut and dried as a lot of people seem to think. Certainly the people at the Soul Foundation, or some people, the most vocal people at the Soul Foundation would be my position. Yeah.
And the contactees, I don't know if you've read an article by J. Gordon Melton. It's called The Contactees, a Survey. It's actually from this book, The Gods Have Landed.
Yes, I've certainly read that. Yes, that holds a pride of place on my bookshelf, and it should hold the pride of place on every 17er's bookshelf. Man, one really irritating passage in this book I'm reading was the author, again, quite well-meaning, intelligent. He's really moved on from that book, which I'm not talking about it in any detail. But he talks about Kripal and Pasulka as the avant-garde of people taking the UFO phenomenon in its religious guise. And I just roll my eyes when I read that, because that book that you just held up was from 1990, I think, and it's drawing on a lot of stuff that goes back to the beginning of the phenomena. There's lots and lots and lots of people who are looking at it from this point of view for a very long time. And it's just, it's all forgotten. As Manfred Frank, the German philosopher, says, history does not do us the favor of moving forward. There's so many things that are forgotten that have to be relearned and remembered. And it's amazing how quickly some things can be just forgotten or never even learned. Yeah, Melton, that's a great, because it goes, I think it begins with Swedenborg, if I remember. Yeah. And it comes up into the more recent decades. Yeah. Yes. But even that's dated now. So as our conversation has revealed.
Now, Alan Hendry, who wrote, I think, just one book on UFOs back in 1979, the UFO Handbook, which still really holds up today, I think, in many regards. But he was already talking about the Valleeization. He didn't use that term, but kind of he called it a main sequence like, with the stellar evolution, how stars go into various stages of development. He was using the same sort of analogy for describing how many UFO researchers go from a kind of nuts and bolts take to a more esoteric and paranormal take like Vallee has. And do you think that trajectory, it's not universal, like some researchers stay in that nuts and bolts mindset, for example, but do you think that trajectory, when it does happen, is it more down to personality, or is it due to the fact of just being around the topic for so long?
I think it's the character of the phenomenon. That would be truer to say, because, I mean, if you take something like the Tic Tac seriously, I don't, but I can see it's not a clear-cut case at all. And some very serious people who are much more conversant in physics take it very seriously. But you see things that are within our framework, our techno-scientific framework, impossible. And the more you hang around the field, the more stories like that you hear. And then, so you begin to sort of try to expand your explanatory framework to include these reports, to account for them. And this leads you into what has hitherto been called sort of psychic phenomena, whether it leads you to sort of esoteric, or kind of what Kripal calls the impossible, which is coming to be, it's turning out to be a very useful expression. What your question is swung more to someone like Amy Michel, and Vallee quotes him. He says, well, you begin by studying these things as a scientist, as a nuts and bolts, and you end up reading Arabic mysticism, as Vallee did. But Vallee was always already in there, right? He was a Rosicrucian from very early on, so he didn't come to that. It was kind of there, and then I think he got brave enough to just to own up to it. So I think it's a character of the kinds of observations that we have, the available frameworks and concepts that we have right now in the so-called Western world, the so-called advanced societies. And this has been a very serious limitation on the whole discourse, because we really have to, and again, I'm as much to blame as anybody, as guilty as anybody, bring in the experience of peoples in South and Central America, Latin America, because their experiences are very different. The kinds of things that they see are very different. This has been well recognized for decades, right? That in South America you tend to see little hairy dwarves rather than tall blonde people, for example. What about Africa? Boy, I don't know anything about African ufology and how it's taken up. Australia we understand fairly well because it's been colonized. But yeah, there's a lot more going on in the world. And it's interesting to sort of see, well, what about African ufology? What have the African ufologists, what trajectories has their thinking followed? That's an interesting question that I have no clue about. So yeah, but the answer is the weirdness of the phenomenon, the weirdness of the observations, the reported observations, and the available concepts that we have to begin to try to account for these things. But again, as you say, not everyone goes there, right? Some people stick quite strictly with the hard physics. But still they want to sort of argue that, oh no, they must be ultra-terrestrials, or they must be extraterrestrials, if not extratempestrials or interdimensionals. Those are kind of off to the side. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I'm just thinking it's also a function of our quote unquote secular society. Charles Taylor, the great Canadian philosopher, wrote the book on this, right? It's called A Secular Age. It'll choke a horse. It's a very, very serious study, but it's not the loss. It's not the quote unquote death of God taken in a vulgar sense. Rather, it's the dissolution of traditional Orthodox religious institutions into what today we might call quote unquote spirituality, right? Which opens the door to what hitherto would have been called miracles attributed to angels and or demons or the Virgin Mary or divine intervention. into more woven into sort of a more enchanted or re-enchanted worldview. And indeed, this notion of the disenchantment of the world that goes back to Weber is very hotly disputed in a lot of very interesting ways. Kripal has his heroes. You have the whole idea of the post-secular coming up in the 1980s with people like Charles Taylor, Jürgen Habermas, and others, which is that the admission that the purely rational resources of Western Enlightenment are not sufficient to guide us morally or existentially, and therefore we can turn back to and begin to draw on our religious traditions or our literary and artistic traditions for orientation, which reason of its own is not capable of providing. And of course, we see at the same time, right, a rise in religious fundamentalism. We saw it with the war in Afghanistan and the Taliban and so on. And of course, now we see it in your neck of the woods with the sort of Christian nationalists, right? The kind of American Taliban, if you will. So, religion, quote unquote, spirituality, quote unquote, the paranormal and all these things, it's all woven of the same threads, if not part of the same cloth. It's a big tapestry, different corners of the same tapestry, maybe. And so that's what's available to those of us who want to think outside the box. And so it presents itself ready to hand.
Mm-hmm. And have you read any work by Keith Thompson?
Yeah, Angels and Aliens, I read many. That was one of the first books I read, which was a great, really, really refreshing read. He got a new book, which is on the shelf. I'm eager to get to it. I don't know. The little bit that I've read of it, an interview I've seen with him didn't leave me very impressed. I was very skeptical of some of the positions he was taking, but I don't have any firsthand knowledge. So I have, again, hedged my bets there. Have you had a chance to read the latest book?
Not the latest one. I've almost finished reading the first one, Angels and Aliens. And
yeah, I kind of like that one.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't know if his take is entirely original, but it is very, very interesting. I like sort of his focus on treating the UFOs kind of, if we think of there being some sort of meaning behind it or even intelligence behind it, that we could think of it in terms of Dionysus and Proteus and the other Greek gods. And the trickster as well. He talks about those sorts of the ambiguities and kind of the ambiguities, right? Is sort of what keep people going. And that a lot of UFO cases, they've got on the edges, like it's hard to define what's really going on, because just as soon as you think you've got a case nailed down, there's a new aspect kind of arises that you can always draw a different conclusion from it. And I think that is kind of seen in the Tic Tac instance and those sorts of stories where, you can take completely opposite views based on whatever pattern you think is relevant in that story.
Yeah, the Tic Tac case is very interesting. In part, I mean, one fact that's used to argue against its quote unquote reality is the fact that the two pilots who witnessed it had different accounts, right? One said he saw it for 5 minutes. The other one said they saw it for just a few seconds. Yeah. At the same time, those who argue for the reality of the phenomenon, it's mentioned in this book by James Madden, it's mentioned in, I think, a Pasolka book, is that two observers will in fact see different things for the same sighting. And they will point to that, not so much as evidence of that it's not real, or objectively real, as it were, but as a character of the phenomenon itself. And this gets to be a very interesting and at the same time frustrating element of the discourse, because what we're dealing with here with this focus on the quote unquote the experiencer, you're entering, and Kripal is quite upfront about this, a Gnostic discourse. So there are some people who have access to a kind of information, but because it's an esoteric information, right, given only to a few, not an exoteric information, it's not subject to science, right? Because the scientific object is in principle exoteric, right, open to everybody, at least once you've learned learned how to use the methods and the instruments and so on, right? So I mean, the observations that are made at the CERN collider are in principle exoteric, public, but for most of us, it's kind of esoteric because you've got to be a really highly specialized person to see it and understand it. But this in itself is esoteric. Only few people can have access to it. And so this opens up a very interesting little can of worms. If you think of something like second sight, right? This is from Celtic mythology. People, mainly women, who can see the little people or ghosts, right? This is very interesting. It doesn't lend itself to any sort of public scrutiny, but if you accept it, then you've got this really epistemologically curious case, and then how do you deal with that? I'm not affirming that reading of things. I'm not saying that the two pilots saw one thing, but because of their respective brain chemistry or whatever, they witnessed it differently. This was a thesis of Gary Nolan's for a while, that there was a brain structure that was particular to people who had experiences, right? Like a little antenna in the brain kind of thing. But we can't discount that possibility either, right? Even in color perception, right? Some people are colorblind and some people are not. And we managed to live together quite well. And maybe there's just a different version of that at work. At least that would be what some people would propose.
But I do think that Thompson goes too far. I think that his take is ultimately kind of naive. So I wouldn't credit it as such, but I'd still point to it as an interesting kind of a take to think about. And he does raise some interesting points.
Yeah, I'd have to go back to it myself and review it. I mean, angels and aliens, automatically it invokes von Daniken and you find, and even Jacques Vallee's Passage to Magonia. How different is Passage to Magonia from von Daniken at the most important level, right? The analogies that they're drawing, right? Von Daniken would want to say, along with the ancient alien people, oh no, the gods are aliens. Vallee wants to say, well, no, they're both different aspects of the same underlying reality, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't find. I wrote a piece. I published it at the Society of UAP Studies blog recently, and it was also on Skunkworks, taking this whole idea to task because of a talk that I heard at the last SUAPS conference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the argument was just against this trans-historical interpretation of the phenomenon that, it's always been with us. Well, okay, where's your evidence? Well, your evidence is only ever going to be texts from distant times and places, and how do you know we read those texts correctly, right? So as I posed to the anthropologist who gave the talk, I said, well, listen, if we take, the classic example of the vision of Ezekiel, there's a number of ways to take it. It was a real event that in principle was witnessable by more than one person. It was exoteric, or it was a religious experience that was witnessed only by Ezekiel himself. It was esoteric, or what's all the more persuasive, it's a very powerful piece of religious poetry, right? Which its symbolic articulation seems to suggest very strongly. And this is the one thing that, and I think it's because of a certain scientific and a certain kind of North American prejudice that language has ultimately got to refer to an experience. Language ultimately refers. So that when an Old Testament prophet says, the word of the Lord came to me, even a highly sophisticated scholar will take that as referring to an experience, rather than understanding that those words are a way for someone to gain authority in a particular time and place. It's a rhetorical formula. And what's important are the effects of those words, not the referential validity of those words. And this was a bone of contention I had. It's something I explore, I lay out in greater detail in that blog post at the SUAPS site.
Uh-huh.
Right?
And
So this has been a bone of contention for a long time, right? And this is hermeneutics in action, right? We can't assume that we can't take stories at face value, and even what it means to take a story at face value is a problem. There's a wonderful quotation by a theologian that goes something like, it's not that ancient peoples were so naive they told literal stories that we're smart enough to take symbolically. No, they were so sophisticated they told symbolic stories that we are naive enough to take literally. That is got to be driven home time and time again in this discourse.
And that's how I suppose you would personally delve into these sorts of stories without landing in crazy land or going down a rabbit hole.
Oh yeah, for sure. The really interesting thing is the stories of skyships from medieval Ireland. There's a post up at Skunkworks, which is really great about this, because what's often pointed out is there's a story of a skyship dragging an anchor behind it, and the anchor bounces along the ground and it gets caught in a door arch of a church, and a little man comes down and cuts the rope, and the church was on display in the church, and etc. And then during the airship wave, you've got exactly the same story from Merkel, Texas, of an anchor being dragged along the ground by an airship that gets caught in a building, and a little guy comes down and cuts the rope, and off it flies. And this is a lot of people make a lot of stuff about this. I do in my poetry. But what happened? This is wonderful. The medieval skyship stories, especially around in Ireland, were part of the way that monasteries got visitors to come to their place, because telling marvelous stories was a way to attract kind of the tourists of the day, if you will. And this is a well-established literary genre of the time. Well, fine. What about this mysterious story that's repeated in the airship mystery? What's going on there? How did that happen? And of all the places, I found it in the book by Jacques Vallee and Chris Albach, Wonders in the Sky, and it's in a little appendix. And what they did is they found that one of the people who wrote how did it go? The story from Ireland was reported in a newspaper in America, which was then recast by another newspaper into an airship story.
Yeah.
Right. So this kind of philological work, right, is so essential, because it reveals the factual vacuity of so many reports. It's my hunch that if one had the time one could look at every story in the airship wave and just realize that no, it's nothing but a series of hoaxes, a series of stories to generate sales, in the same way that the medieval monks told stories of airships back in the day to get people to visit their monastery. I bet that could be done. That would be someone, I throw that out there, hoping there's some graduate student listening, some graduate student in media studies that goes, there's a paper, there's a dissertation. And you can go and find that out for us.
Yeah, that would be wonderful, actually. I guess the next question sort of tangentially touches on that, but I was wondering if you could offer a reason why NICAP and APRO, two major civilian UFO research organizations back in the day, they were reluctant to kind of credit the CE3 and CE4 stories. Do you think it was because of a sort of separation of church and state instinct within ufology?
That's a very good question. We know, for example, that Alan Hynek himself was very skeptical of contact stories of humanoids involved, and it was the Lorenzens if I remember correctly, who kind of like opened the door to that and they gathered a lot of these stories. And they were associated with APRO, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because NICAP was Kehoe and Company.
Yep.
And I think that, I mean, I can imagine with Kehoe and Company, they wanted to be taken seriously. Like you make this distinction between church and state. They were the first people to call for congressional talks, congressional meetings. They saw it as a security issue. They saw it maybe as a scientific issue. And to talk about little quote unquote green men would just throw the whole effort into disarray. I think also the fact that you had these stories from the contactees, which were laughable, kind of threw a kind of a kook factor in. And so again, you don't want to be associated with that if you want to be taken seriously, right? No, look, even the Air Force admits that there are these aeroforms in the sky, right? We think of the estimate of the situation in 1947, right? They're metallic, they hit radar returns and this and that. They were taken to be real objects in the sky, and they wanted to run with that, and that's the way to be taken seriously. Like even today, notice that the congressional hearings in the United States, it's, well, pilots saw this, pilots saw that, right? You invoke the authority of, again, this is an old trope, but you invoke the authority of the specialized, highly trained observer, right? The Air Force pilot, the police officer, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, we know you scratch that and that falls apart pretty quickly too. No disrespect to these highly trained people, right? So for NICAP, that would be my guess. APRO, I don't know. I'd have to dig into them a bit closer, but I would imagine maybe it's the same kind of thing. But this is also something that Vallee would point to right away. It's like, notice how the reports are shifty in a way that there's always this something disrespectable about it, right?
Yeah.
That keeps science away from it, that keeps quote unquote serious, sober people away from it. Now, what's going on there is itself again a very interesting question. If we are sort of anti-realists and say, well, in a way, there's nothing behind the phenomenon other than misperceptions, hoaxes, stories, so on and so forth. Wow. What drives this social psychosis, as it were, this visionary rumor, to in Jung's terms? That itself is interesting. But then if you take Vallee's point of view, well, no, there is some quote unquote reality behind the phenomenon that presents itself. Something is presenting itself. Something is presenting itself. And why is it so elusive this way? Why is it so evasive this way? Which I think is why he opts for this kind of quasi-paranoid idea of the control system, for example, or the fact that it isn't what it is. And I mean, I've made this proposal a couple times on Skunkworks, and it's something, again, once I get time, I might want to look into this, is how could you develop a semiology, a semiotics, a grammar, if you will, of the UFO observation. And Vallee has made some steps in this direction. You might remember at the back of, there's that trilogy, there was Revelations, Dimensions, and not Encounters, but the third of that trilogy, he's got this kind of, you've got the CE 1, 2, 3 from Alan Hynek. He's got a tenfold grid, which is much more refined. And they're working towards a kind of grammar. And we would take our lead from Vladimir Propp, the morphology of the folktale, and Levi-Strauss's structuralist mythology and structuralist linguistics. And from there, you could begin to articulate the significant signs that are involved in a UFO event. And you wouldn't arrive at an interpretation, because that's hermeneutics, but you'd arrive at a grammar that would have great potential, I think, both in terms of folklore, in terms of social psychology and sociology, and so on. Mm-hmm. I need some research assistance. Okay, John, this is your job. Mary, I want you to work on this. Fred, get on that airship thing. You know, because that's the thing. If you want to take it seriously, no one person can do this in a certain way, especially if you haven't bought into one particular version of events like Vallee did. He began again, right? Not only as a Rosicrucian, I forget when he became a Rosicrucian, but it's funny Rosicrucianism. But he begins the interest in the phenomenon with a sighting in the 1950s of during the wave in France of your classic little silver daylight disc with a little transparent cupola that a friend of his saw, and they triangulated their observations and found out, they're looking at the same thing, whatever the hell that was, right? So he begins as a believer. And his first book took the extraterrestrial hypothesis very seriously, right? Challenge to science. Was that it? Anatomy of a Phenomenon. That was it. Then comes Challenge to Science with his wife. And then very quickly he begins to go off in another direction. So. Yeah.
And Hynek, remind me, but I think Hynek did become more sympathetic to the close encounter stories with the Zamora case.
Yes, I think that would have been it. Now, see, that's a very interesting case. That is one that resists resolution. People have said, "Oh no, it's a hoax from college students." Well, that doesn't hold up in court very well. That would be that's one of those cases which is really, really very interesting. They're not, you know, it's not an alien spacecraft, not by any stretch of the imagination. But what exactly he experienced is a very good question. It's a very good question. I don't know.
He mentioned it was an egg-shaped craft, right?
It was kind of egg-shaped on a I think it was on 3 or 4 legs.
Yeah.
But it was an egg-shaped and more like a Tic Tac. I forget, but it had this insignia, which has been a topic for debate ever since. You had like 2 little guys in overalls that see him. They jump in the thing. There's a flame that goes from underneath, a kind of a bluish flame. It goes up in the air. The flame goes away. It makes this whistling sound, and off it goes. And depending upon, I mean, Vallee makes something of this in his book Trinity. That if you look into this, oh look, there are other people who said they saw it, and this and that and the other thing. But I mean, there's no reason to think that. Well, I don't know. Did he make it up? I don't think so. But you know, who knows? It's a mystery, which is why it's so interesting.
Yeah. But in Trinity, Vallee and Harris do talk about an egg-shaped craft.
Avocado.
Avocado. Okay.
Lemchos, yeah.
I was going to ask about the egg, like I guess the roughly egg-shaped trope. Do you know if that's more? Is there any evidence that is more common in rural cases? Because could there be a sort of you've mentioned that the egg is a kind of powerful alchemical symbol.
It is.
Could that be more prevalent in the rural cases? Maybe because of the literal proximity of eggs, farmers.
The proximity of eggs, yeah.
But
this I don't know.
Relating to the earth and, the cycle of life.
Yeah, the egg, it's very, very interesting. The oval shape. I mean, Jung, of course, would make a lot of hay of this because, of course, the egg is important in the alchemical discourse, which he delved into quite deeply. Yeah, I don't know if there's any prevalence of egg-shaped observations in the countryside. I know that we had, was it a family friend or a family relation, and we were visiting their farm when I was a boy, and their son told me that their dad had seen a flying saucer over the slough, which is the kind of the pond they have in the back. So I don't know. In Saskatchewan, there's a very famous, very, very famous sighting. You had these, they were either spherical, maybe they were egg-shaped. They were small, shiny, metallic spheres that landed in the man's field, and they had these snaky tentacle legs that were going all over the place as they're probing for something. And it was very, very terrifying for the poor farmer. And I think they finally took off, and they left little nests in the field. Very, very famous case in Saskatchewan. So these are ones I know. We know very famously the sighting in the lavender field in, I think it was Valence, France, where the farmer stopped, and there was an oval-shaped craft, and these little guys with oval-shaped heads, and they pointed something at him and paralyzed him, and he was paralyzed there for hours. And this the very, very famous case, very, very famous case from the French wave in the 1950s. I don't know. It is surely a very prevalent shape in reports. Why? Well, let's write a book and we'll have a different chapter for each theory. I don't think there's any aerodynamic advantage to have an egg shape, but I may be wrong.
And have you read any of Gideon Reed's blog? He talks about a lot of cases where the abductee or the experiencer did actually apparently have some knowledge of science fiction tropes, even though we often hear that sci-fi stories were not known by people in the bayous of whatever, Louisiana. How could they know about obscure, French early 20th century science fiction? But in reality, like there were ways of transmitting that knowledge, sometimes through intermediary American authors, and that could well have informed those cases. I
don't know this person's blog. I'd be interested if you send me their link. This, of course, is the real grist for the mill of what I call, not very accurately, the psychosocial hypothesis, that ultimately our perceptions of UFOs are informed by science fiction imagery. And it's Martin Kottmeyer who's a real machine in this regard. There's no sighting that he can't point to as having a precursor. It's an interesting idea, but it raises the question of exactly the one that you just raised. Well, okay, if that's the case, and it bears a prima facie persuasiveness, how is it in a particular case, for example, that this particular imagery imprints itself, or that the witness was exposed to it? So we have, for example, the imagery that Betty Hill uses to describe the aliens, which of course, were produced under hypnosis. And, the argument is, as Kottmeyer has pointed out, well, those aliens, they sure, sound like these aliens that were on a Twilight Zone episode that was broadcast 2 or 3 weeks before. Okay, did Betty see that episode? I mean, this has got to be established, right? There's got to be a chain of evidence, as it were. A causal chain has got to be determined. So, and that becomes very interesting and very labor intensive in itself. And of course, the thing is that whole problematic develops over time and place. It's a different question in 1947 than it is now in 2025, right? Where we're living in a kind of a hyper-real media environment, where the images are so universal and so inescapable that it doesn't matter where you are. If you've got a cell phone, and you most likely do, you've been exposed to some sort of science fiction imagery. Right. So again, these are the sorts of fine-grained questions that have got to be raised with regards to questions of this sort and hypotheses of this sort.
The other thing, of course, in the UFO mythos is religion, and I would say that the contactee movement or era was like solidly religious, kind of all the way through. But do you think that is the search for transcendence and inclusion in a sort of larger totality at base, is that a religious yearning, or is religion itself embedded within like a larger emotional structure?
Oh boy. I don't think there's one answer to that question. The word, okay. There's no doubt that human beings have had a quote unquote religious impulse. We find this universally. Shamanism is the earliest form of quote unquote religion, but you got to watch that word religion, right? It's a very new word. It is, after all, a Latin word, right? Did the Greeks, right? Did the Greeks of Homer have a quote unquote religion? Well, it's not like what goes on in your mosque or your church today. Whatever they were doing, they had temples, but it's very, very different. But certainly, yeah, even this invocation of transcendence, that's a very culturally local idea. The world is a mystifying, marvelous place. And I think that even our proto-human ancestors had a sense of that. Schleiermacher, who I raised earlier as the father of modern hermeneutics, was also a theologian, a very, very famous theologian. And all of his friends were atheists, his friends, the Jena Romantics. And he wrote a very, very famous tract in defense of religion, to which learned despisers, he called them. And he pointed to the root or the heart of religion being in a sense of profound contingency, dependency, that our lives are not in our own hands. We don't know where we come from. We don't know where we're going, either as a species or as an individual, right? We're just pushed into the world, and we leave the world often not at our own decision. And there's a sense that, well, this, if you've ever asked yourself seriously the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Yep. If you've ever felt the power of that question, then you have felt that sort of lightness, that sort of, whoa, wait a minute, wait, there's right, the bottom falls out of the solidity of being, and it's that sense of absolute dependence, right, that Schleiermacher is pointing to. Aristotle writes that philosophy begins in wonder. Well, I think probably this religious sentiment, this spiritual sentiment, begins in wonder, in feelings of being not so much transcendence, but of being limited. How's that? It's kind of the inside of that. It doesn't necessarily call for an outside. Just say, the world is bigger than I am. It's bigger than what I understand it to be, right? And so perhaps from this feeling, right, flows the belief in an invisible world, right, inhabited by spirits, that the shaman, that certain members of the community can negotiate with and talk with to find lost objects, to cure diseases, and to maintain harmony in the world, and so on. This is much more true to my own feelings, my own experience. I think that might account for a lot of things. But then in terms of the so-called advanced societies, to get back to what I was saying before, right? We are in this secular age, this post-secular age, where these religious sentiments are present, these feelings, these needs are present, and they find answers in various forms and venues. And I guess that's what's interesting about human beings, is all the ways that this need, or this thirst can be assuaged. A lot of very interesting stuff going on in the world. I've got a great book here. Oh man, it's even in terms of traditional Christianity, you have people like Timothy Morton, who wrote a book called Hell, which is this highly sophisticated philosophical Christianity. Slavoj Žižek just wrote a book called Atheist Christianity, which is great. And so you find a lot of people, it's really interesting, accessing the traditional body of material and reworking it in a highly original, very interesting, very, very modern way, without any orthodoxy to it or any theology to it at all. Right? So we're in very interesting times, and I think a lot of us are reaching out for whatever resources we have to kind of bricolage some sort of machine or some sort of shelter to get us through what's coming up on the horizon.
Yeah.
I mean, you see this, and this is what I wanted to say earlier on. You see this in Bernardo Kastrup. This is very interesting. He published a little while ago his take on, he began interested in UAP for a while, but he's since lost interest, and it's interesting why that might have happened. But he wrote a long paper, you can find it on his website, on the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, right? The idea that there is some non-human race living on the Earth, but in a way that we may be under the water, maybe under the ground, whatever. But if you read it very carefully, he talks about, well, this race could have gone underground to hide from this or that. And what he's talking about is precisely what we're facing with climate change, with global warming and the ecological crisis, is a situation where this way of life on the surface of the Earth is over. It's over. I'm sorry, we're not on the same planet anymore. There hasn't been this much CO2 in the atmosphere for 800,000 years, and human beings weren't even around, right? And it's never happened this much, this fast. So things are going to be very different in 100 years. But when he talks about imagining this ultra-terrestrial, this technological civilization, it's very clearly a kind of an unconscious fantasy about how we might end up hidden. And then you add that to his kind of analytic idealism, right? Which again is a flight from the real. It's a flight into the ideal. It's a flight. Matter isn't real. Only mind is real. Well, what an escape hatch. I mean, what are you fleeing from? You're fleeing from the terror and the understanding. I was telling my students just this week, because we're reading a poem that deals with a woman thinking about climate change. And they say, oh, she's scared. And I say, yeah, anyone who's paying attention is scared. Doesn't mean we give up hope. Doesn't mean we panic. No. But anyone who's paying attention is unnerved, for sure. And you find it in the UFO discourse, in this drive towards the immaterial.
Yeah.
Right? And what's the great irony, and this is going to be something I've got to write about very soon, is this focus on quote-unquote non-human intelligences. But the irony is that these non-human intelligences, as they always were throughout the whole UFO discourse, are human, all too human, because we can interact with them. They understand us spontaneously, right? There's that Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. You might remember these big cylinders come and they cause chaos on Earth, and they're piloted by whales. They're cetaceans, and they don't recognize what we monkeys have built on the surface of the Earth. They just don't see us, right? And so why would a quote-unquote non-human intelligence even recognize us as an other, right? Like they do in Star Trek, right? No. The world is teeming with non-human intelligences. I'm looking at one outside my window right now. There's one walking across the street right there. But these we ignore because they're not us. This is what's at stake for me, as you know, in this whole discourse. This anthropocentric ignoring of anything that isn't Elon Musk, right? Even the discourse around artificial intelligence pegs in quote unquote intelligence as problem solving, as if the only people on Earth who are intelligent are the people who designed AI. But in fact, there are all sorts of other quote unquote kinds of intelligence among humankind, among human beings, and among the things living on the Earth. And once we surrender this fetishism of the human, then we see very clearly the anthropocentrism and the ideological commitments of the whole discourse around UFOs, UAP, non-human intelligences. And this is what I'm so eager to unmask relentlessly. Even colonialist concerns. You find this in Vallee. You might remember a little column I wrote that takes him to task for this. His pegging Joseph Smith, right, in Passage of Begonia, as a kind of as a non-human intelligence intervening in human affairs, right? as part of the control system hypothesis. Okay, well, fine. Where are they guiding us? What's the result of that intervention? The result of that intervention is the colonial conquest of Utah, right? And the murder of thousands of First Nations people, right? The closer you look at the kind of, the function of the myths, right, that are invoked by these non-human intelligences, they seem on the side of the white colonialist. They seem on the side of the settler colonialist. And you got to wonder, well, wait, why is that? Right? The moment you take Vallee seriously, suddenly you realize that, oh, they're trying to kill us all. If these myths that have been given to us from these non-human intelligences over the course of time are pushing humanity in a certain way, it's towards their own demise. Because it was the Industrial Revolution and the advent of technoscience that is, in fact, the very condition for climate change, global warming.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting point you raised about the people who are afraid of the effect of climate change, as they should be, but sort of retreating back into sometimes immaterialism. Do you think that explains partly the CE5 appeal? That it's a sort of, maybe it's a tacit admission that there's no tangible physical evidence for aliens, and so it sort of takes on this more shamanistic take. But could it also be like a retreat into, because it's got telepathic and ESP elements to it, could it also be a retreat from the anxiety we feel? We just want there to be some reality behind the crude physical reality.
I think there's at least three things going on. First, this desire for a kind of Nietzschean Übermenschlichkeit. I mean, maybe you're younger than I am, but there was a great science fiction show from England in my boyhood called The Tomorrow People. And the Tomorrow People were these kind of pre-adolescents, adolescents that were the next stage of human evolution. And of course, what did they have? They could teleport, they had telepathy, they had all these things. It's like the X-Men mythology, right? And so I guess part of the appeal of this, again, the human potential movement, right? That, oh no, we do possess these things, we just have to culture them, is one way of transcending the human situation that we're in, that we are, in the hopes that maybe then we can find our way out. You also find this in New Age discourse about how, these troubles on Earth are going to lead to our moving to a higher frequency.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you're kind of like attuned to these things, then you too will be saved. It's a very, very Christian eschatological vision. At the same time, you also have, especially among these CE5 people like Greer, is the contention that the aliens do have a kind of technology, a free energy technology, that of course would solve our problems overnight.
Yep.
Right. So again, salvation from the sky. So either it's either through our own evolving into some super creature, or changing dimension, or receiving this technology from the stars that then will open up our Star Trek future, as is said, which again is so naive, because if we actually had such technology, it would be monopolized at the drop of a hat. Right. Yeah. And exploited for profit, and it wouldn't help us, wouldn't help the majority of people anyway, which is always missed by these libertarians that think this way. So I think those three drives at least behind this, and again this urge for transcendence, because wouldn't you want to run out of a burning house? To transcend that burning house, transcend that life-threatening situation. And keep in mind, too, that for a lot of Americans, as you know, far better than I, life is hard. Life is really hard in the States. There are lots of people working 2, 3, 4 jobs, and they can't make a living, and they don't have medical insurance. And, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about this. And the material desperation of people leads to extremes.
Yep.
I'll say that much, right? And of course, we have that in Canada too. You have that throughout the so-called developed world because of 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, right? And it's cutting back, and life becoming more and more precarious for people, which I hope doesn't affect you too onerously. So,
yes. The honorousness of life for many Americans, it contributed to the rise of Trumpism and the so-called MAGA movement. But I always felt that there was something really mythical going on with Trump, that he could sell a story in a way that the Harris team couldn't. This mythical aspect, though, it seems to have also a destructive element, that it, like, somebody talked about Shiva the Destroyer as kind of the god that's operating, with Trumpism, where people just want to see the establishment burn, or the old world burn, even if it hurts them. So that's the ironic thing, is that these people who are hurting themselves from economic difficulties and whatnot, they themselves are almost willing to allow themselves to be hurt, as long as it gets back at other people who they take to be the cause of their pain, or the establishment, so-called, even though Trump is really part of the so-called establishment, or is part of an elite, albeit a different faction of the elite. Do you see that sort of mythical, destructive thing at play here as an important part?
No. I'm a much more materialist thinker in this way. There's a great book on this matter by David Seymour called Disaster Nationalism, and it's an application of the critical theoretical approach, both looking at the material conditions of the people and the psychoanalytic dimensions, the sadism and the masochism involved in the whole thing, at this desperate strait in human history. And it seeks to account for the rise not only of Trump, but of Modi, Bolsonaro, Orban, and all these really reactionary, proto-fascistic movements around the world, Duterte in the Philippines, and so on.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that your description is quite on, right? That you see people who resent what others have, and they would burn down the whole house just to get back at the people that exclude them.
Yeah,
absolutely. Seymour says that fascism is the politics of despair. It's the politics of desperation, and resentment, and sadism. And so he pulls this all together in a very, very interesting way that I've got to reread. It's a real thick book. But our descriptions line up perfectly. I just wouldn't go at it. I wouldn't invoke any myth. I would just say, just look at the material situation of the people, and look at how human beings will react in that situation when they're prodded a certain way.
I only bring that up because even with Trump himself, with the tariff shenanigans, there seems to be something almost, obviously counterproductive, but it's like all he had to do with the economy was just keep his mouth shut and take credit for whatever good came, and blame whatever bad happened on Biden, is what he's always done, right? But instead, he's gone for this whole catastrophic policy around trade wars and tariffs, and bringing back like the Gilded Age type of tariff system, and all that sort of baggage. So it seems like there's kind of something else going on. It's just this feeling.
Anyone observing the present moment knows better than to try to second guess Donald Trump. There's no understanding the sheer chaos of the man's behavior. We do know that he's always talked about tariffs, going back many years, even before he ran for president. Tariffs. So tariffs. So now he's in a position to use it. It's a very, no economist can wrap their head around what he thinks he's doing, because it just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It seems to be driven by resentment. It seems to be driven by his whole having been a real estate agent kind of mentality. This whole 51st state nonsense seems to stem from Justin Trudeau's laughing at him at one G7 conference. It's a very famous picture where everyone's laughing because Justin Trudeau cracked a joke and Trump was the butt of the joke. So you never really know what's going on. And it's interesting how he, first they're on, then they're off. It's a show, sadly, that we're not even an audience member. We're part of the show. And all we can do is watch in horrified amazement at each new twist in the plot. And it's only just begun. It's only just begun. So, yeah, you might know that we're in the middle of a federal election here in Canada. My wife was howling in the background as she was watching the leaders debate. And of course, the big question for all the candidates, there are 4 of them, is like, who's best to deal with Trump? Who's best to handle Trump? Right? That's the question. And of course, the eco-socialist that I am, I have a whole different approach to the matter. I know very clearly how we can assure Canadian sovereignty and independence, but none of those 4 guys are going to go in that direction. And that's a whole other deal. Yeah. So the Trump show. Yeah. What I'm interested to sort of see is now that Harvard is sticking up for itself, right? There's a big battle with Harvard. You're going to be in the middle of a constitutional crisis soon because he's basically telling the Supreme Court he's not going to listen to them when it comes to repatriating this poor man who was sent away to the prison in El Salvador. The Supreme Court is mulling over whether to hold certain members of the Trump team in contempt. So it's a really interesting moment in the history of the oldest democracy on Earth.
Yeah.
We can only hope that he backs down, but we'll hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that in the future.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a little bit touching on that, but I guess this could be the last question. In discourses about like sort of the experiences of the numinous and the UFO high strangeness aspects, the breakdown of traditional or standard categories and blurring of boundaries in many encounter reports, that some scholars have pointed to that as a sort of socially disruptive content of the UFO story, and that it could even speak to oppressed or marginalized groups. Do you think that, I don't know if you know about many kind of right-wing or conservative UFO skeptics, like I'm thinking like Steve Cambion, Robert Schieffer, and a few others.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of very, the way that they treat the UFO topic is kind of just, they latch onto certain fraudsters or narratives within, like ridiculous narratives within the UFO milieu, and they sort of treat it as sort of like a game or something to mock, right?
Yes.
But do you think that there's a sort of unconscious or latent opposition to the emancipatory aspect of the UFO, that it could speak to, for example, marginalized groups, and that for that reason it's mocked and sidelined by these commentators?
Well, you put your finger on something very interesting, because what you do have is a kind of epistemic struggle between those who experience things that can't be accounted for and those who would explain them away. The classic example is, of course, the French peasants who kept saying, there are stones falling from the sky. And of course, the wits at Versailles would just mock them. Of course, we know now they're talking about meteorites. And there is the cliche of the tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist who's not very well educated, right? Or the hick who gets abducted and probed and this sort of thing. So there is a kind of epistemic struggle which does work along class lines at sometimes. And this is something I was very interested to follow up on in terms of Fortean phenomena in general, and the way that it functions in the society, and questions of authority and knowledge, right? Because knowledge is monopolized in our society. And so the Fortean phenomena is a space for a kind of a democratic claim, a democratic epistemic claim, democratic epistemic franchise, if you will, which has traditionally been denied to people. And even when they have it, it doesn't make a difference, right?
Yeah.
Because in the United States, you've got like two-party system. But same thing in Canada. I mean, it's we're reduced to voting for the person we hate the least, right? So this need for franchise for to be taken seriously. So it is working in that way for sure. And so when Schaeffer and his ilk pursue things the way they do, it's a little bit like with the Skeptical Inquirer. They can be really arrogant at times, not as serious as they should be, right? And I've written in response to some things that Schaeffer has said. He was writing about Vallee's
Metalogic or metalanguage.
And he didn't understand it. I mean, Vallee's a computer scientist. He knows when he's talking about metalogic, I know what he's talking about. Or better yet, one can take Vallee in a much more charitable way.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than just dismissing, because Schaeffer took him to talk about, well, if it doesn't make sense, then I've got this category metalogic to cover my ass. That's not it at all. So the thing is that the job they're doing is a kind of epistemic reactionary behavior. It's funny, you find a kind of intellectual like that. The new atheists were a little bit like this too, right? Sam Harris is still a little bit like this. You've got these really reactionary, arrogant intellectuals who look down upon people who are taken in by things like religion, or again UFOs and the impossible, to use Kripal's phrase. So there is definitely some sort of social struggle, a need for epistemic recognition, epistemic franchise, claim to truth, claim to reality. And this segues, back into what we were just talking about, the resentment of a certain part of American society and Filipino society and Canadian society that feel left out, that feel, they've been called deplorables, right? And they rightfully resent being marginalized in this way. And so when someone comes along and promises them, no, come on in, we'll make things great for you again. And with the whole DEI nonsense in the United States, I mean, Jesus, what a mess. So the same sort of thing is going on. But
it's a little bit
interesting. Sorry. Yeah.
It's a little bit funny because there is a contingent within quote unquote MAGA which does believe in UFOs and does go into those conspiracy theory type laden stories. But then you've got like the Schaeffer and Cambion types who are kind of aligned with Trump in some ways, but they are almost punching down, I think, because they're very irrational and anti-science when it comes to other things like 9/11 or JFK or vaccines, right? But then on the UFO topic, they've got this weird fixation. They seem almost like hyper-rational, aggressively rational. And it's almost like they're choosing like a low-hanging fruit in the society or the culture to sort of demonstrate that, oh, look how scientific and rational I am, so that it's almost like a way of buying credibility so that you can do irrational things elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't, it is funny how you do have these MAGA people, I mean, in the government, right, who are taking this all very seriously. And of course, it's just, those of us who've been with more than a passing familiarity with the discourse just roll our eyes at their naivete. And these are people in government who want to pass laws and stuff. Kevin Randall, if you keep up with Kevin Randall's blog, He's always rolling his eyes about, well, we've heard this story before. He just published a long blog post about the Kingman Air Force, the Kingman UFO crash story. Kingman, Arizona, I think it is. And how in Chris Mellon raises it up again. Right. And this is the funny thing with this Chris Mellon guy. He was in there. He was like, what was his position? It was a high up position in intelligence or the military.
Yeah, under Secretary of Intelligence or something like that.
Yeah, but he's just like, spinning yarns right and left. So either he's malevolent or he's ignorant. One's never too sure which it is, to be honest. But because he's Christopher Mellon and he has this, it's like the Admiral Galladay. I keep getting his name wrong. And of course, he's an admiral and he's got things to say.
Yeah.
But no, he's an admiral and he's like anybody else. And how well informed is he about X, Y, or Z? But no. So he was at the Archives of the Impossible conference giving a talk. But whatever, and it's funny how that continues,
Yeah.
And ironically, the last person you want to believe is someone from the Air Force, the Navy, the military, because they're not going to give you a straight answer on anything because that's their job. And they're not necessarily better informed than anybody else anyway. And then the stuff they seem to fall for, like Grush. I mean, the stories Grush was peddling, we're just, been there, done that, read this. I got a book on my shelf right here. I know what he's talking about. Flying saucers crashing in Italy and so on and so forth. The poor guy was fed a line, or he's feeding the public a line. Probably the former, but who knows? But this is old hat. I mean, Gerald Kehoe was talking about stuff like this from the get-go. So it's a long story, but again, it's funny how it's the same old. It's just the same pattern with no developments, except this like swish into the kind of like paranormal, impossible kind of thing. So, yeah.
And that itself evokes the image of the mandala that Joseph Smith and Jung talked about. Although I don't know how much hate to make of that as it's being symbolized in the imagery of the UFO, that maybe it's symbolizing itself, that it's a recurring perennial story. But there are many other motifs of UFO shapes, and so that's probably way too simplistic.
Yeah, there was a great Canadian fellow who wrote a book about the Belgian wave, and he tried to apply a kind of a Jungian approach to why they appeared as triangles. Yeah. With the lights where they were in the red one in the middle and so on and so forth. Jung is interesting poetically. He provides a lot of information, but I don't take him seriously in the more metaphysical ways, the way that Kastrup does. Kastrup thinks that Jung is a great thinker, very intelligent, very learned, very creative man. Don't get me wrong. And I can't speak to the effectiveness of analytic psychology, right, as a psychoanalytic practice. But yeah, I disagree with Jung in a lot of important ways. But that's another story.